Hello, welcome to This Dementia Life. I'm your host, Chuck McClatchy, and I live my dementia life with Alzheimer's disease. During these podcasts, you will have amazing interviews with amazing people living with dementia and the people that care about us. My guest today is Beth Soltzberg. She's the director of Dementia Friendly Massachusetts and the Jewish Family and Children's Service Memory Café Percolator at the Jewish Family and Children's Service in Greater Boston. Beth, thank you so much for taking the time and coming with us. Why don't you kind of introduce yourself and kind of explain maybe a little bit, where your passion comes from to work with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me, Chuck. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm a huge fan of your work as well as Dementia Action Alliance in general. And we just had a big blizzard this weekend here in New England, so it's nice to be connecting with someone in a warmer part of the country as well. So as you mentioned, I'm based at Jewish Family and Children's Service outside Boston, and I run the Dementia Friends public awareness program for the state of Massachusetts and have the pleasure of working with people all over the country and in several other countries on making memory cafes available as well. I'm a social worker by training and really love what I do. And I guess, for some people, they have one big reason that they've come to what they do. And for me, it's more a mosaic. It's more a bunch of little pieces. Before I came to JFNCS, I was a hospice social worker, and I worked with several individuals who were living with dementia as they moved towards the end of their life. And they taught me a lot about ways to communicate and connect on a deep level that transcended language and some of the ways that I was used to communicating. And it really sparked something for me when I had the opportunity to come to JFNCS and really dive into this work. I was so happy to be able to have the creative arts be part of that. I am an art school dropout from way back and, kind of left that behind, but the Memory Cafe movement has a lot of creative arts involved, and I love bringing that in. And then finally, I've always been really passionate about inclusion in general. You see behind me one of our poster boards from Dementia Friends Massachusetts. We have our materials in 9 languages so far, and we work with many different cultural communities. And so both in that dimension and also around wanting people living with dementia to have the opportunity to tell the world who they are, what they're about, and really support breaking the stigma and silence around dementia. Those are all things that are really important to me.
Well, I'm so glad you talked about the different cultures that you work with, because we have, out here we have, the African American community, we have the Latino community, we have the Native American community, and each one treat dementia differently. How have you been able to work with so many different ethnic groups and get through to them? Because I think that is so difficult sometimes, because they have one way of doing it, and a lot of times they're doing the wrong things, but they're doing it for the right reason because they love the person. How have you been able to kind of transition that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that question. And I would say it's a lifelong journey. It's not something where a person ever gets to the point where they say, okay, done, because people are different in so many ways. And when it comes to something as personal and powerful as living with dementia, all of those differences become really salient and important. So I would say there's differences, and then there's also disparities and barriers. So to just talk about differences, yes, people in different cultural communities turn to different people and go different places in times of stress. They have different ideas about caregiving and aging and about what is dementia and how it should be handled. And then there's also barriers of trust due to discrimination that many groups have been targeted by for generations. And so that also becomes a very important issue to recognize and build trust through relationships and being trustworthy. And eventually some of those barriers can be broken down. So I would say the way I've worked with it is, first of all, to recognize that if I'm going to run a program called Dementia Friends Massachusetts, it's my responsibility to serve all the people of Massachusetts. And just like where you are, we have a very diverse state. And so if I see that not everybody is coming to the table, I need to try to dig into what the barriers might be, or whether what we're offering is as relevant to all members of our community. And what I have been doing over the past several years is getting resources through grants. We've been supported by Tufts Health Plan Foundation so that I can provide resources to community partners, because they often are working with very little resources to serve a lot of people. And I can't just ask them to keep coming and advising me, without any resources. So that's been really important to have, sincere partnerships where the learning goes both ways. And so we've been able to translate and adapt Dementia Friends so that it really works and is useful in many, many communities, and that work will continue.
What do you think is the biggest hurdle with the cultural groups that are very wary of being involved? Because I know that like the African American community and actually females don't seem to be as open as other groups are. I go back to when I was with the Alzheimer's Association on the early stage advisory group. Out of 10 people, 8 of them were men. And it seems like with national spokespeople, the saddest thing about that is we all know each other, and that's how few people will. And even though that it affects women more than men, and African American more than Caucasian, what do you think is the biggest hurdle on getting people to come out and talk about it?
Well, as a white woman, I can only speculate. I don't want to try to speak for the Black community, but in my work with partners in the Black community here in our area, in reading and trying to understand, I would say, and this is kind of a general statement that can apply to anybody, I feel like the more barriers that a group has to transcend, the harder it is to become an advocate, to be in that public role. And I have noticed the same pattern that you're talking about. And I've been very encouraged that recently I've seen more African Americans talking about their experience living with dementia. And it's just wonderful to see, because I know that it's so important to people to be able to see someone who looks like them, who understands their culture, their context. I think that really helps people feel more comfortable being open themselves about their diagnosis and being able to learn about living well with dementia. And I hope that we'll see the same trend in lots of other cultural communities as well. It's interesting because in the volunteer-based programs that I run, it's almost all women. So it kind of depends, but I think, we know that women predominate as caregivers, and maybe there's a lot of socialization and barriers that tend to keep women, more in the background. But again, hopefully we can all work towards equity and, noticing, just as you're noticing who's at the table and who's not, and then identifying barriers that might be there.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think we have to have everybody at the table to talk about this and what what we can do to overcome a lot of the issues. Now you work a lot with children. How do they kind of accept the fact about, grandpa is changing or grandma is changing, and this is why? Are they kind of open to that, even at a younger age?
Yeah, I think that children sometimes are more adaptable than adults because they don't carry so many preconceptions about the way a person should behave. And it's interesting. So, one of the things I get to do with one of my fellow social workers at JFNCS is to run a support group for adults who have a parent or parents living with dementia. We've been running this group for about 8 years now. And a lot of our participants also are raising children. And so we talk about this from time to time. They'll say, I'm worried about whether my children are going to understand this or what should I tell them? And, we will often say they will surprise you. They're going to have an easier time with a simpler explanation than an adult might. And oftentimes the young people are able to just accept, okay, this is a person I love, and this is what's going on. Not always, sometimes it's a harder situation where there needs to be more, the parent needs to be more active in facilitating that relationship and connection. But in general, I think kids can show us the way. I wanted to say one other thing about the last question you asked me. Do you mind if I jump backwards for a second? Just as we're talking, I'm looking at my bookshelf here and a book that I have on it by an author named Harriet Washington, and it's called Medical Apartheid. And it's a history of how African Americans have been mistreated in the medical and scientific worlds in this country. And I need to mention that as part of my response around why sometimes we might see that it's primarily white people stepping up as advocates. I think there's a barrier of trust that comes from something very real, and that's a generational legacy of terrible abuse. So I really applaud the African American individuals who stepped up and become advocates. I think they're really making such an important contribution. I just want to recognize that, that's a legacy that, for example, in this country, I don't have to bear. And it's very significant for white people such as myself just to recognize that.
Oh, I couldn't, I couldn't agree more. We have a gentleman, Brian Van Buren,
Mm-hmm.
that is African American, and one of his relatives was, I guess, back in World War II, they did testing on African Americans, and there is a real distrust in the medical industry, and that's why it's so important to have people, like him, that people can see coming out and talking about it, and having more women coming out and talking about it, so that people can say, well, boy, I can relate to exactly what they're saying.
Yeah.
One of the biggest obstacles that we have with talking about dementia is all these preconceived ideas and all the myths that literally scare people to death. That I like to say that, yeah, there might be 5 million people in the US that have been diagnosed with dementia, but there might be 10 million that haven't. That people are so afraid that they never go to the doctor, they never get checked. And it's how in your work do you try to overcome those myths and all of those untruths out there, concerning dementia?
Yeah, it's such an important question, Chuck. So as a social worker, I'll start with one of the principles of social work, which is meet people where they are. So much as I would love to, always be able to encourage people to be really open in talking about dementia, I have to start where the person is, and people are in all different places. So some individuals who are themselves living with dementia really are not comfortable or not willing to talk about it or really not aware of it, and sort of they and their family have a tacit agreement that we don't go there. And I can't bulldoze anybody. I have to respect where they are. I don't know how it feels to walk in their shoes. So I think with anything, it's always important to meet the person where they are. And then from there to try to represent the potential for living well with dementia. And this is something I don't feel that I can do nearly as well as you and other advocates who are living with dementia can do. I have seen time and time again, the single most powerful thing is when people can hear directly from someone living with dementia. So in the Dementia Friends program, we offer hour-long interactive information sessions about living with dementia to members of the general public. And part of that is a short video that shows 5 individuals living with dementia talking about how it affects them. And I feel like that video is the most important part. And time again, I see people just really, you kind of see the light bulb going off over their head. So more and more, I feel like my job is to facilitate opportunities for people to hear from folks like yourself, and then to support all the different individuals and families I encounter wherever they are. Not just in, talking about living well, but also grieving, because that's part of life, frankly. It's part of coming to terms with any kind of diagnosis that you didn't ask for, you maybe don't know much about when it begins, and you have to go through this process of changing your vision of how things are going to be, and that involves grieving as well. So I think to support people anywhere they are along that process.
I think that's so important for people to understand that when you get hit with a diagnosis of whatever type of dementia that you have to have time to grieve. You have to have time to get mad. I know with me, I went through every emotion there is. And I would, every so often my mind would just be flooded with images of what's going to happen. I think there's a lot of people like that. And I was suffering from severe anxiety. When it would hit, I could feel my blood pressure go up, my heart pounding, and it's real.
Yeah.
And after a period of time, and I was really having trouble, Bobby came in and set me down and says, this is not who you are. And that was the little nudge that I needed.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so important to understand where somebody is at and be able to talk on their level, because at certain times, we don't have the ability to come to your level. You have to come to ours. Why do you think that's so difficult for a lot of people to understand?
Yeah, I think that it's always difficult to put oneself in somebody else's shoes. And I think there's a lot of fear about dementia, and fear creates that silence and those barriers, so that sometimes people might just rather walk away or look the other way. And one of the things that I think is so tragic is that so many people I know who are living with dementia have seen that their group of friends and sometimes family members have kind of winnowed, so some people have stepped up and some people have stepped back. And in fact, one of my sort of soapbox ideas is I always want people to attend memory cafes with a friend, with someone in that outer circle of the family, who maybe has stepped back, just because they don't know how to spend time with this person who has been so important to them, but they don't know how to spend time together anymore. So I feel like attend a memory cafe together, it's just relaxed, it's fun, and just whatever it is, stay connected. But it is often very daunting for people to do that.
Oh, it really is. I know I've been, at a gathering and stuff, and to me, some friends will come up and they'll walk up to Bobby and say, "Well, how's he doing?" It's like, well,
And you're right
I'm
there.
sitting right here. You know, I can hear you.
Yeah.
It is because it's so important because they don't know what to say.
Hmm.
And you brought up a very good point about, family and friends. A lot of the people that I've met on this journey, with dementia have lost a lot of people, have
Yeah.
lost friends, have lost family members who just couldn't accept it. And it goes back to the myths. And I think that I know that you probably profess this, but how communication between family members, being able to talk about it, putting a sense of humor in there where you take that tragedy thing and oh my gosh, this is happening, and be able to understand what's happening and help the person where they're at with what they're going through. How important do you think that the communication process is with family?
Oh, I think it's absolutely critical. And James Baldwin had a magnificent quote, which I'm going to butcher here, but it was something to the effect of, not everything can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And to open up the communication is so critical. And I have found throughout my life, almost, or really any subject, no matter how overwhelming it may seem, once people actually start to talk about it, and that includes knowing it's okay if I say the wrong thing. It's okay if I don't know everything. If I, God forbid, make a mistake, it's okay. Um, I think a lot of the charge starts to diminish on the topic to where people can just kind of take a breath and sort of be together and cope with it together. Not that it's easy. And we were talking about grief, and grief, it's not a straight line. A person may do a lot of grieving and feel a lot of emotions, and then there are times where it may come roaring back. And that's just the nature of it. But I think if we can talk about it, then we can be there for each other. People can support each other, and it just makes it less scary, less difficult, more manageable.
That's so important. I have a friend, and you might know him, Mike Belleville.
Yeah.
Well, I've known Mike for almost 7 years now.
Mhm.
And he was feeling bad because he couldn't see all of his family members at one time because it was just too much of an overload. But through the talking with them, and they all understood, that they still get to do basically the same things, only a little bit different. And that it's smaller groups.
Mhm.
And talking with Bobby, that if we go to the store and all of a sudden I have one of those times that you're talking about where all of a sudden the anxiety comes back, and I can just say, Bobby, we got to leave. Don't have to
Mhm.
explain. We just do it.
Yeah.
And that communication process is so, so important. And it helps change that mindset that a lot of people have of, from, I really shouldn't do that. They don't want me to do that. Well, then I'm not going to do that. And it's just, yeah.
Mhm.
And it changes to, something, I want to do that. I know I have to have some changes there, but help me do it, and bring everybody in on that discussion of how still to do what you may, that the one thing in the world that you want to do is that
Yeah. Yeah.
everybody put in it. And is that kind of what you think what, the communication process does?
Yes, yes, I do. And I love your example of you and Bobby figuring out a way to be able to go to the store. And if you're feeling anxiety, you can just say to Bobby, okay, we've got to go. And my guess is it probably took a while to kind of fine tune that approach, but the two of you hung in there together until you found a way to make that work. And that's what communication makes possible, is to find that technique that then allows you to do those things you want to do, to go to the places you want to go. And of course, it's an ongoing process because it may be that over time there's a new approach that's needed. So communication really is the foundation of that in order to be able to work together to find a way to make the accommodations. And sometimes they're small accommodations, sometimes they're big, but it is absolutely amazing what people living with dementia can do if only the world lets them. And I think that your sharing stories like that about you and Bobby going to the store is so important because you're role models then for other people who say, you know, okay, well, I've been fighting this so hard or pretending it's not real. What if I can focus some of my energy on problem solving? What if we can problem solve together? Then who knows what's possible.
One thing too that I think is so important is to bring a little bit of humor into the conversation, because I've noticed that with talking with people, if I can laugh and joke about things, they feel more open to say something. And I'm one that, you know, I'll give you an example. Bobby and I went to the store and she was getting she likes rye bread. So she's looking at the rye bread. And I said, Bobby, what is jellyfish rye? And she looks at me with kind of a strange look, but I looked at the flaps that were overlapping, and it was Jewish rye. But my mind, you know, seeing all the letters just came out with jellyfish rye. And we were able to laugh about it, you know, and it takes that tragedy thing. So do you try to develop when you talk with people, you know, and a lot of people misunderstand a sense of humor about this, that we're not just, I don't care about anything. It's that, okay, I have this, but you know something, I'm gonna smile and laugh anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that jellyfish rye. That's great. You know, I think humor is amazing. It really does something in our physiology when we can laugh that just kind of reduces the tension, and then we can see more possibilities, we can think more clearly. And so I had mentioned the support group that we run at JFNCS, and we often say at the beginning, the other facilitator and I will say, you know, all emotions are allowed here, crying, swearing, and laughing. And they all happen there because there are moments for humor. And my goodness, we've got to seize those moments and enjoy them. And I agree with you. It's not about making light of the situation. It's about living. You know, it's about living with ... You gotta laugh. It's so helpful.
And my last question, I always ask this to everybody that comes on. If this podcast was the first one that they've seen since getting a diagnosis, what would you tell them?
I would tell them, look at Chuck, feel encouraged that everybody has their own path. It's not the same for any two people, but you can live well. And the best way to do that is to communicate openly. And that includes the whole range of feelings, and get support. You can't do it alone. You know, there's actually a lot of people out there that want to support you. So reach out.
Well, Beth, thank you so much for taking the time. It was great. I think people got a lot out of this. So thank you so much for being with me.
Oh, it's a great pleasure, Chuck. Thank you so much for having me, and take good care.
You too. I'd like to thank Dementia Action Alliance for their behalf of This Dementia Life. If you enjoyed our podcast, you can get them on danow.org and click on podcast. Please join me again on the amazing people on This Dementia Life. And I'm your host, Chuck McClatchy. Remember, the brain may forget, but the heart remembers. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.